If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Sonia. I'm here with Truth in My Days director John Torse. John, what apologetics topic are we going to be discussing today?
I think it's time to get into the area of textual criticism.
What's textual criticism?
Textual criticism is actually a very little-known field of study when it comes to the Bible, and yet it's extremely influential. It essentially governs what you read when you read the Bible, especially the New Testament. It's not just about how you translate. You know that there are differences in approaches to translation, but this is something that is more fundamental. It is an apologetics issue that in some ways could be considered more important or more serious than even historical criticism or even Darwinism, partly because so few Christians know about it and even fewer of them understand what's at stake when it comes to that.
Why do you think so few Christians know about it?
It's a very specialized field of study. Those who go to seminary will get a brief introduction to it, though they generally will not go into a lot of detail. They'll just be told in Greek. There will be a session on textual criticism, which will last a couple of weeks perhaps. They'll be told certain claims, and the students will accept it without question and then move on. But it's not something that gets out into the general public, or at least it didn't. The first time I think it really got out into the general public was in the year 2005 when Dr. Bart Ehrman, the evangelical turned agnostic, published a book called Misquoting Jesus. And this was actually the first introduction of textual criticism for the masses. And the purpose of this book was to try to convince people that really we cannot be sure about the text of the New Testament, whether what we see is really what the authors wrote. And there are quite a number of responses from evangelical textual critics. But they tended to be very weak because, in fact, they don't disagree with Ehrman on this. They agree with him. They only disagree about the significance of it or the extent. But the essence of it, they agree with it.
Does that have anything to do with what you said about the claims being given to them at seminary?
It does, yes. They are told these things, like so many things in historical criticism and elsewhere. Evangelical scholarship has adopted an awful lot of liberal paradigm assumptions in these fields without even realizing where they actually came from. But let's move into what actual textual criticism is. And let me introduce it this way for you. I'm going to give you some verses, and you will pull out your NIV Bible or your NASB, your ESV, English Standard Version, or if you would like your RSV, Revised Standard Version, or your New Revised Standard Version, pretty much any modern translation other than the New King James. I'm going to ask you to look up some verses and you read them out for me. Okay, we'll start with Matthew 18:11.
John, I don't see it.
Okay, how about Matthew 23:14?
I can't find it, John.
What about Mark 7:16?
Not there.
Mark 9:44?
Not there.
Mark 9:46?
That's not there either.
How about Mark 15:28?
Seems to be missing.
Luke 23:17?
Not there.
John 5:4?
Well, this one is gone too.
Acts 24:7?
It's not here.
Acts 28:29?
Not here.
Yeah, see, we could keep going on like this, and I could give you a bunch of verses, more verses, and you're going to look for them, and you're not going to find them. And usually when you point this out to Christians, they're quite surprised, because they would look, for example, for Matthew 18:11, and they'll look in their Bible and they see Matthew 18:10, and then the next verse is Matthew 18:12. Or John 5:4, they're looking for 5:4, and they see John 5:3, and they see John 5:5, or 5:6. They don't see these verses, and they never even notice that those verses are not there anymore.
Well, if those verses are pretty much only the New King James Version, how do we know it's not a problem with the New King James Version instead of all those other ones?
Well, that's a good question. But before we get into the details of textual criticism, let me point out a few other things that you will notice in these different translations. This one from the NIV. And if you look here at the last chapter of the Gospel according to Mark, you find the account where the women go to the tomb and there's a young man in a white robe who tells them that Jesus is risen. And he continues in verse 7, "But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then, what do you see? You see a line across the page and a note saying, "The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9-20. And again, this is something that surprises Christians when they first encounter it, because what it means then is that Mark actually ends at verse 8. The account of Mark ends with the women going to the tomb, finding it empty, being told by a young man that Jesus rose, and to tell his disciples. They don't tell the disciples. They run away. They say nothing to anyone because they're afraid. The end. The risen Jesus never appears to them. It's the end of the story here. And that seems very problematic to have the story end there, and yet we're told in the NIV and the NASB and the ESV and so on that, yep, that's where it ended.
Well, that is problematic, but at least the other gospel accounts would include the resurrection, right?
Well, they would, but then if we're told that Mark is the first one, and Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, you can see how liberal skeptics would be given a great deal of ammunition to say that the resurrection is something that was made up later, if it was not there in the earliest gospel book. And then there are other problems as well. If we look at Mark chapter 1, okay, and we read verses 1-3, again, we're reading from the NIV, "The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It is written in Isaiah the prophet, 'I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him.'" Now you see those little superscripts there directing you to where these quotes are from. And part B, the second part of this, verse 3, "A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him," comes from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. The first part, as we check the superscript, "I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way," we see that that comes from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. Now, do we see a problem here?
Well, Malachi 3, verse 1 is not Isaiah the prophet.
Yeah, that seems to be a problem. Verse 2, it says, "It is written in Isaiah the prophet," but the passage then that's we're told is written in Isaiah the prophet is not written in Isaiah the prophet. It's written in Malachi. That would be an error, wouldn't it?
Yeah, how can our scholars get out of this one?
Indeed. And this then leads us into this whole field of textual criticism. Now, what is textual criticism? Scott McKnight, in the book Interpreting the Synoptic Gospels, defines it this way: "The science of determining, as far as possible, the original text of the New Testament and attempting to understand the reasons for changes." Now, is there anything in this definition that makes you take notice?
Attempting to understand the reasons for changes, like where do the changes come from? And as far as possible, does that mean it's not possible to completely determine the original text of the New Testament?
Yes. Is the original text even missing? Why do we have to determine it? And yes, this definition will tell you that this can only be done as far as possible. And in fact, textual critics will tell you we cannot. recover the exact original text in the New Testament. We can only try to get close to it. So what does all this mean? It seems very confusing at this point. I thought we had the text in the New Testament. It was written by the apostles, and it's come down to us, translated into English. What is this about determining the original?
And it's inspired by God. Wouldn't God make sure that we have the original text of what he said?
Well, you might like to think so, yes. So let's look at the background to all this so we can understand what we're talking about. When was the New Testament written? What century?
First
century AD. Now, when was the printing press invented in the West?
1400s?
Yeah, for roughly 1450 to 1455, somewhere in between there, about 1453 by Johannes Gutenberg. The Chinese did actually have one earlier than that, but it was Gutenberg who invented the movable type press, very good for an alphabetic language. And so the New Testament was composed in the first century, but there was no printing press to copy it. When we have our Bibles, they've come nicely off of modern printing presses, and every copy that comes off the printing press is exactly the same as every other copy that comes off that printing press. But we're talking about a period of about 1400 years where there was no printing press. So how was the New Testament passed along through those years? How was it transmitted?
Well, scribes must have been making copies and copies of copies.
And how did they make the copies?
They must have had an exemplar and copied it by hand.
Copied it by hand, exactly. For 1400 years and earlier for other materials, the only way you could reproduce a written document was copying it by hand, making handwritten copies. There was no mass production of manuscripts. If you wanted another copy of any document, the only way to do it is to be copying it by hand. What that meant is that books were extremely expensive. You couldn't mass produce them, it'd be expensive. A lot of people who couldn't read didn't bother to read because there's no point if you couldn't afford to buy books. But the point is the copies were done by hand. And the originals, if you look at an original manuscript, one of these copies made, we don't have the originals. We don't have the Gospel according to Mark written by the pen of Mark. We don't have the Gospel according to John written in John's own hand. What we have are copies that were made by these copyists. We call them scribes. And the scribes would make copies of the original, and the other scribes would make copies of those copies, and then other scribes would make copies of those copies, and so on.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.